I like a slow roll in, you know. Oh, it's 2:01. That's fantastic. 15 people are waiting as we speak. Yeah. Everybody looks nice and awake. Diego, what's the temp? Where are you right now, my friend?
I'm actually in Colombia. So I came from Guatemala last week and I'm resting a little bit. Travel start again. So it's nice. It's nice. But I mean, I'm resting this week.
Okay, let me do our big intro. Hello and welcome to Color Space Cadets. I am Jeff Greenberg and I'm your poor man, Warren Eagles, hosting for today, where we're going to be talking about possibly the most important thing professionally in our field, in my heart, which is not just HDR, but specifically Dolby HDR. And with me today, I happen to have Abby Matthew. He is the worldwide tech lead. He is the head of training and certification for Dolby Vision. I have my dear friend, my brother from another mother, somebody who I would go to the wall for, Robbie Carmen. He's the lead colorist of DC Color. And just, man, he makes me feel dumb every time. I got to work hard to keep up with him. And speaking of people who humble me all the time, there's Diego Yama. He's a colorist instructor. Man, if you said to me you used to pole vault, I would believe you, Diego. Thank you all for joining us here. He's an instructor, by the way, with iColorist. We're going to be talking today about HDR. If you're watching us on YouTube, I'm going to tell you, I've got the chat open in front of me. Hi, Richard Cross. If you feel like you have a question, if you have specific things you want answered from these wonderful people, feel free to chime in. The concept here, this is a pub talk. If we were all drinking beer or big coffee as we are, we're going to talk about this. And I'm going to start with just a little foundation, just so everybody has some comfort here. Hey, Abby, thank you so much for joining us. Can we get a little history of HDR and Dolby's involvement, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. And good to see you, everyone. So it's a question I get all the time. I do a lot of training. I meet a lot of people trying to get people up and running on Dolby Vision. And the question I get is, why is Dolby known as an audio company doing imaging? It's a popular question, and we love answering it now because we've been doing it for close to 7 years. So Dolby, for the last 50 years has been working with the sort of the entertainment industry, trying to improve entertainment experiences. And we did a lot with audio, and I think about 10, 15 years ago, people in Dolby got together and said, what can we do for imaging? And that's where this whole thing began. And like we did with audio, we first looked into the industry to identify what are the biggest problems that people have. Everyone says, yeah, we'd love to make images look better, but then we try to understand what that better could be. So one of the things we understood was that cameras, digital cameras especially, were capturing a lot of dynamic range, and the audiences were not able to see it. So there was this big gap, right? So, if you talk to cinematographers, they say, I know this camera can capture 17 stops of information, but I know that my audience doesn't get to see even a fraction of that. They get maybe 6 or 7 stops. So that's where it began, right? And, we have a big pool of engineers and scientists at Dolby, and we all got together and said, what can we do about it? And one of the things that came out of that was the discovery of PQ, or perceptual quantizer. Many of you may know what that is, but PQ was sort of a fundamental step in trying to find a way to capture these, high dynamic range images, package them into some kind of an image format, and then be able to distribute them, right? And like with everything that Dolby does, we play the entire ecosystem. So right from capture to content creation, and being creative with content, and then delivering it and distributing it, and then being able to play back. And that's what we've been doing for the last 10 years, right? So, 10 years ago, when I joined the company and started talking about PQ and HDR, no one in the room would know what that is, right? Everyone will be like, PQ what? And everyone was like, but we use gamma, isn't that good enough? And we're like, yeah, it has limitations, right? But today, every time I have a discussion about PQ or HDR, the next thing is they'll say, yeah, I just go and buy a TV or get my new iPhone or my iPad, and I can just plug into Netflix or Apple and watch Dolby Vision, watch HDR. So it's been a journey, being able to get to where we are. And I'm happy to say that we have so many people creating content in Dolby Vision today. And, it's still sort of work in progress. We're still trying to get, listening to people saying, what are the problems? What would you like to improve? What would you like to fix? And the fixes are happening all across the ecosystem, right from acquisition to post-production tools, to televisions, to devices. So yeah, it's an ongoing journey.
It's been an amazing revamp of this field in a lot of ways. I feel like we've suffered through the promises of things like stereoscopic and 4K being the big thing, where, when I first saw HDR, and I was lucky enough to be around Robbie when that happened, this changes everything, because suddenly you can really see colors that you could never see before, as in standard dynamic range. And Abby, don't feel you have to answer this, because I know Robbie and Diego get this one all the time. Could we get a very short overview of Dolby's specific process? Robbie, that's you, brother.
Oh, that's me. Okay, I got it.
Yeah, I mean, Robbie, you did all sorts. Like, I've always been, watching from the sidelines, cheering you on as you go, oh, I got to ship this CMMU back, because we had it on loan because it's a prototype. Please, my friend.
Yeah, I would echo some of what Avi said as well about sort of how integral Dolby has been into this research about how we see and how all this stuff. I think it's important to say, and Avi, can obviously integrate more on this, but Dolby didn't get into this to make TVs and to make whatever. They're like, hey, we're doing the research. We're going to hand that off to standards bodies and to manufacturers and all that kind of stuff, and do what you will. And so they keep developing that process. And actually in Dolby Vision, it's incredible how much actual experimentation went on to create the system that we're currently in. And I agree that it is getting better and better as we go down the line. But the Dolby process is pretty straightforward, Jeff. These days, pretty much every major color correction system, well, every color correction system has built-in Dolby Vision support. How that's implemented varies slightly from place to place. But essentially, it's setting up a project. Color managed projects are obviously a little easier to work with in an HDR landscape than non-color managed projects. So that could be, ACES or TCAM or whatever flavor you want. And then, the basic idea is that we're going to go ahead and do our HDR grade, right? That PQ grade. And I actually think it's important to say at this point, a lot of people are like, oh, we're going to grade in Dolby Vision. You're not really grading in Dolby Vision. Dolby Vision to me is a delivery system, right? And like a downstream system. You're grading in the HDR PQ, right? So at the end of the day, you can take that same project and make it HDR10. You can make it Dolby Vision, whatever you want. But the basic process is do that HDR grade, get everybody happy with that HDR grade, and I'll say it probably multiple times in this conversation, but it is a new language. It is something that you have to get used to as a colorist. If you're like me, the first mistake you'll make in the HDR landscape is turning everything to 12 just because you can. And that's maybe not necessarily the best way to do it. But do the HDR grade, and then it's the analysis process, right? Dolby's algorithm basically analyzes the shot for the darkest pixel, the brightest pixel, the average pixel, right? And from that data, creates interpolations of what that HDR grade is going to look downstream. That might be lower nit value HDR, like a 600 nit, but it's also the SDR version that's created. As a colorist, after that analysis is done, I can sit with my clients and I can go through these various downstream levels, right, as many as I want to, and make creative decisions on what those downstreams are going to look like, right? And with the idea of trying to get them to be as faithful and truthful to the HDR version as possible. Now you ask, well, why do you have to match it? Well, because in HDR, we obviously have this immense amount of luminance that we can deal with. We have this huge color volume that we can deal with. Downstream, we might not have those things. So, the classic example is a bright red stop sign or, traffic light or something like that, right? In HDR, it's like, whoa, right? It's super red, it's super bright. The SDR, well, something has to give. You can't have in an SDR, limited pipe, you can't have something that's super, super saturated and super, super bright. So those trim controls, kind of the 50,000 foot view of them is the idea of using them to massage the image for those downstream deliverables. After that, it's just rendering and packaging for various, outputs, QC of Dolby Vision, of course. And that's kind of the simplified look at the system.
The only thing I'm going to ask in here, and just to make it really, really evident, in whatever color system you're using, and I'll pick Resolve just because it's so democratic. You do your HDR grade, and then you use words in there, trim pass, Robbie. You come back and you trim, you pull back everything. That's what a trim pass means, right?
Yeah, it's kind of, well, actually, one more thing to add to this, because you mentioned Resolve in particular, I think it's worth noting that with Resolve in particular, everybody has access to Dolby Vision. Dolby Vision is integrated even into the free version of DaVinci Resolve. What is an extra licensing fee is, of course, if you do want access to those creative trim tools, you can work with Dolby and get a license for that. But yeah, trimming is it's not necessarily pulling back. It might be adding in, right? I think of it just sort of as massaging the image to work on a different display target than your HDR reference monitor, right? That might be a 600 nit, consumer OLED, right? That might be a SDR LCD, whatever. You're massaging that image to get it to be as creatively, faithful to the original grade that everybody did.
Yeah, I think a key point there, Robbie, you brought that out really well, is that Dolby Vision is a delivery format. One of the things that we did besides, developing HDR and making it practical was to solve a big problem that's been there forever, which is, you create your content in these, meticulously calibrated environments. But then once it goes out into the real world, you have absolutely no control over it. And, we all know every consumer out there thinks they know how to set up their TV better than anybody else. And they know that the picture, they can make the picture look better than the colorist did, right? That's been the case. And, all the studios have been telling us that, is there some way where we can control how they look at these pictures? Because we have no control over it. Once it goes out there, it's gone. And that's what Dolby Vision was trying to do, right? The point was we wanted to replicate or recreate the creative intent. Whatever you graded, we will try and reproduce that on a Dolby Vision device. And in order to do that, like Robbie said, we analyze the image, we create metadata that effectively tells the playback device how to recreate that image. Now, it's math. Right? I mean, it's an algorithm, right? So we analyze 3 values, we try and rebuild those pieces on the other end. But then there is this one component, and this is something, we internally have been supporting very heavily, because, there are other HDR formats that do not give you that option, right? Where you say, math is enough, math will reproduce everything. But then we very strongly believe that the human element is very, very important. Right, all the math in the world. I mean, we just improved our, we had a, an introductory level of Dolby Vision, which came out about 7 years ago. We improved it about 2 years ago with this new version of Dolby Vision called 4.0. The math just got way better, but we still believe that the human element is important, and that's what the trim pass is for. Right, the metadata does most of the work, but there's that bit, that last 5 or 10%. Where the colorist says, yeah, I like the math, but I need to go in and adjust something. And that is what the trim pass is about. So the trim pass is not a color correction. It's just modifying metadata so that when the reconstruction of that image happens, it's more to your liking rather than the math, right? The math is a big contributor, but the trim is what perfects it, right?
Outstanding. Outstanding. Diego, just because I haven't heard from you, my friend, have you been doing a lot of Dolby work, a lot of HDR work?
So you know what I like it, and what Avi was saying about the history of Dolby, and then Robbie start like saying all like steps. So I was thinking that like 5-6 years ago, Dolby was so expensive. It has like this box, and it was like I don't know how much was it. And suddenly, this thing like 3 years, I don't know, 2 years, suddenly is free in Resolve, and then it's like you can activate it just like going to the project settings and then check. And before also was so difficult to find like knowledge about it, like hey, where can I learn? And now Dolby have that certification plan that is also like giving us the users like the abilities to make it good. So I was thinking that yes, like start with a really big and in some way like a movie, but just for some people. But now everyone can at least learn and can still play about it. So that's one of the things that I like more.
And we'll make sure to add to the description here the Dolby Learning resource, because it is, and the certification is amazing. And Robbie, didn't you do some work with that?
Yeah, Jeff, a couple of years ago, my partner Joey Deanna and I, along with Patrick Inhofer, who's a well-known colorist, we produced a series of videos for the Dolby Institute, kind of outlining the process. It was about a 10 or 12 segment thing. It's a little outdated in terms of its actual Resolve stuff, but the bigger picture stuff is right online. And just real quick, Jeff, to echo on what Diego said, because I think it's important, the kind of this democratization of Dolby Vision. And it's right. Like when I got into this probably 5 or 6 years ago, right, right when Dolby was making a big push, I often joked with some of the folks at Dolby that it was kind of like a country club thing, right? Like Dolby, you're only going to find Dolby Vision at like
it was
the largest, highest end facilities in the world. And that kind of like made me, I don't know, a little like, whatever, a little mad at first, right? But if you think about that, it made a lot of sense for Dolby to put Dolby Vision, do the stress test with the largest, most intensive projects in the world to see where it was going to break, the most demanding clients, the most demanding artists, that kind of stuff, and figure that out what it is. And that work has paid dividends for us mere mortals, years later, and how things like, as Abby said, like going from Dolby Vision 2.9 to 4.0, that is directly a result of thousands of colorists and clients around the world going, I like this, I don't like that, right? I like this, I don't like that. And so I think that, to echo what Diego said, I think that's a big deal. And I mean, if I just look on like, Facebook groups and stuff like that, the amount of people talking about HDR workflows now is night and day between what it was 5 or 6 years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We needed to go through that.
Of course, that's development. One day there might be, by the way, I won't even ask what happened to Dolby 3.0. One day there'll be a 5.0 and a 6.0.
Yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
I want to do something fun. I want to take us a little off the nuts and bolts stuff. And I really want all of you to weigh in. How do you approach the aesthetics coming from a mostly SDR world? And yeah, we need to talk about monitoring and setting up a room and the like, but I want to hear a little art here. How do you approach the aesthetics now that you suddenly have all this much more space and room?
Well, I'm sure we all have our own different opinions of this. I mean, I think the biggest, and I tell everybody that I run into talking about HDR about this, is that first, it is, again, a developing language. And I think that even if you look at go on Netflix or wherever and watch shows, you have very, very intense HDR shows that are taking full advantage of, the luminance and the color palette they have. And then you have other shows that are really super subdued, right? And then you have shows that are sort of in the middle. I think from a creative point of view, the very first thing as a colorist that I experienced, I've watched dozens of colorists do this now, right, is you just crank it initially because you keep looking and going, oh my God, do you see that? Do you see that, right? And you keep turning the knob and keep turning it up and keep turning it up. And I would say the first year of, grading HDR, I was really guilty of that. I look back now at some of that stuff and go, oh, like that's not my aesthetic anymore. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I think that language and that process is important for everybody's development in here because we're so used to the SDR pipe, and now we have this HDR pipe, and it takes some practice to kind of build up those skills.
Yeah, and you're right. It's like you just like look at HDR and you want to call your friends, hey, come on, look at this. And you're right, like you start grading and then you saturate more and then you find more colors and you find it like awesome. But then you're saying like, wow, this looks like a video game, something like.
I think that's right. I think that the other thing too, Jeff, just from a quick technical point of view, is one of the things I like to try to talk to people about when they're learning this is kind of the idea of like image segmentation, right? Really kind of dividing the image up into its different areas of like tonal range, right? Because it's super easy to make everything really bright, have an AP, like a high, what we call APL, right? So you have this high APL video. The problem, if you get into the
hold on, brother. You just dropped a word in there, APL. You got to define
average picture level. Okay. So if you have an average picture level that's, 800, 900 nits, right? Without getting too technical about it, it gets really hard to manage that downstream when you have a super high APL, right? So one of the things that colorists we like to think about is like, okay, let's divide this up into shadows, midtones, highlights, but it's even more important in HDR because like I want to take specular highlights and I want to make those things all, glinty metal objects and buttons or whatever, bring them up here. But maybe the bulk of my image actually lives, somewhere down here in the middle. Just because you're in HDR, there's no requirement for you to just make everything super bright. And I think that's where a lot of people, myself included, were making that mistake early on, Diego as well, right? It's like, because it's there, but once you gotta get practice on it, you realize that this is really a helpful storytelling tool, not just a technology demo.
Yeah, I think that is precisely what I see when I train colorists is when you start in HDR, there's a compulsion, there's a subconscious thing that I have to make this brighter, right? And I always get that question because usually they sit in on my training and then 2 days later I get a call, I'm doing my first job, nothing's going above 200-300 nits. Is that like unusual or should I really push this to like 1,000 nits? And I keep telling them, don't be compelled by the numbers, right? You need to be aware of it because you could blind someone, but it's very important to be aware of what you're trying to do, right? Just remember that this new format does not impose any limitations on what you can do, right? You previously, you know that I go and look outside a window and I know it's all this dynamic range and all that, but when I grade my SDR, I have to fit it all into a box, right? I have to somehow make it all look right within the limitations, and we've sort of perfected the art form. Right, over the last 50 years, we've made that SDR look so fantastic. I spent my whole life thinking there was nothing wrong with it till I, saw HDR. So do not be compelled to make things brighter, but try and use that available dynamic range and color to your advantage, right? One of the things that we tell colorists who are remastering existing content, a lot of old movies, we've had some spectacular experiences, remastering things like 2001 Space Odyssey and Platoon and things like that. One of the things is I always say, do your SDR grade in PQ, right, as a starting point, and then try and open up your highlights, your blacks, see what you get. Maybe you'll be surprised, right? But open up your thinking, and Robbie, I think you put it perfectly. It is a new language. Yeah. And the problem is a lot of people are, it's like, I'm from India. So when you sometimes, when you think in your mother tongue and then you speak out in English, that's what you do with HDR and SDR. You're thinking in SDR and trying to make that happen in HDR, right? And that sometimes can be a problem. So it'll take time, let it grow on you, it's, don't accelerate it.
That's so spot on. And I'm sure Diego has experienced this too, Jeff. Like at first, because we're in this much bigger container of HDR, right? PQ and P3 and 2020 and all these other acronyms, you almost feel like you're not doing it right at first because you're like, Amy said this, right? Like for so long, we've been, squeezing high dynamic range camera footage into the relatively limited dynamic range of SDR. And to do so, we have all sorts of tools, right? We have keys, we have windows, we have all these other ways of manipulating the image to get it into that SDR pipe. I like my grades in HDR land are like super simple, right? Like I'm not windowing everything, I'm not keying everything, because I'm like, oh, you know what? I don't have to do anything in that window because it's just that's what it looks like. It's just there, and I'm not having to bring things up and down as much and that kind of stuff. And I think that takes a little while to get used to because you almost feel like, hey, am I doing this right?
Yeah, you have to, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like you're discovering a new world. As you say, it's like you have more colors.
Yeah.
Do I use all the colors, or do I just keep, or what can I do? It's like a test, as you say, Robbie. It's like testing, doing, and also trying to say to the photographer that, hey, let's make something new, or let's make something similar as we use, but let's add a little bit more of beautiful things.
Exactly.
I really have a similarity to any time that you get a new artistic instrument, whether it's a camera, whether it's paints, that you kind of go, pardon me, a little gaudy, a little over the top, until you learn to pull back and make it just accents more than it is just strength. But at the beginning, like when you have new colors are just so much fun to play with.
Jeff,
I want to do
Jeff,
a couple.
Quick,
yeah,
go ahead. It's just important to, again, I said this at the top, but just so people don't get confused, like that part of it is just the start of the Dolby Vision process, but that in and of itself is not Dolby Vision, right? Like we have these standard color gamuts, standard tone curves like PQ or whatever. We can deliver lots of different things from there.
It's the Dolby format, and please, Abby, Robbie, Diego, correct me. But basically, you're delivering a single stream with lots of metadata, and your set does the interpretation rather than you having to do multiple deliverables the way some of the other HDR formats are. How'd I do?
Yeah, so it is correct, but that's not what happens. When you deliver a Dolby Vision master to, let's say, Netflix, they will derive multiple deliverables, right? They will have a Dolby Vision bit stream, they will have an HDR10 bit stream, they will have an SDR bit stream, all derived from that one master. But when you sit at home, your device picks the right bit stream. Correct. So the device is not interpreting everything from the Dolby Vision bit stream. If you have an SDR TV, you're going to get an SDR bit stream, right? And that's all it'll get. If you have an HDR10 TV, you will get HDR10, right? But the benefit is from a workflow and content creation perspective, you can work in this one sort of universal format, just deliver that sort of package, and then the studio can derive all these deliverables from that. Now, again, deliverables is a big aspect of this. Different studios have different requirements. Yeah, exactly. So, everyone has a different spec sheet. Fundamentally, they may all mean the same thing, but they all have little nuances about it. Some prefer IMFs, some don't. Some prefer ProRes, some don't. So you have
still ProRes.
Yeah, exactly. One standard to rule them all, it's not Dolby Vision yet, right? Because studios still want different things. So
but I would argue, Abby, that it's closer, it's easier than other workflows, and I think that's a very fair thing to say.
Exactly, that's what we're trying to do. And like I said, studios come to us and say, yeah, well, there's this thing about Dolby Vision that doesn't work, and we are constantly trying to adapt. We never supported IMF in the beginning. We now support that. That's a big part of Dolby Vision. To the point that you guys made, that in the early days, we were always uncompressed 16-bit TIFF only, right? So it was like, we don't do compressed formats, no ProRes, no none of that. But, like I said, depending on the needs of the industry, we've been adapting, right? We said, yeah, okay, that's important to you. Let's make that work, right? So yeah, it's getting bigger and better.
I have two real nuts and bolts technical items. But before I do, I want to make sure that what they say, aside from the fact that Dolby is sponsoring this is part of iColorist. And we've got two things coming up, and I'll mention it again at the bottom of the hour. We have a mixer coming up on the 30th of April associated with NAB. It's a virtual mixer since we're not at NAB. Of course, Diego will be there, but Robbie, Abby, you're welcome to come. You know, we would love to have you participate if you're interested. And then we're doing all of May, we're doing something called Color Fest. It's 6 instructors, 15 plus topics across all the time zones. There are live online classes ending in sort of a social at the end of the month to come back and chat with other students and instructors. And the cool thing about Color Fest, the 4-hour classes are for about 149 Australian dollars, or about $9.49 for all the classes, but there's this really wide variety of stuff. You can see this on iColorist.com. We'll come back, we'll talk, we'll bring that back. Hey, guys, I've got an HDR screen. I have an SDR screen. First, you know, do I still need the SDR screen? And if so, where am I setting these up? How am I setting these up? And then I just want you to put the bug in your head. There's a professional, and then there's that aspiring colorist moving in. What would be like good for them? Anybody can take these, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so the first part of your question, the setup, right? So Dolby for a long time has, and you know, AB can obviously correct me on this, but has kind of forwarded the idea of a dual monitoring setup, right? The idea that you might have an HDR reference monitor alongside whatever other downstream targets that are important to you, right? And for most people, that would be an HDR and an SDR, you know, standard Rec 709 SDR 100 nit monitor, but it could be, you know, a 600 nit HDR, you know, OLED or whatever that you have as another. It's just a downstream target. That dual monitoring, I did it for a while. And I gave up on it. And I'll tell you why I gave up on it, Jeff. In one regard, it's fun, right? You're kind of doing this like shot matching routine where you're looking at the HDR, then you're looking at the SDR. And as we talked about earlier with trim controls, you're trying to get them to be as kind of creatively matching as possible. But no matter what you do in that situation, it really screws with your brain, right?
Yeah.
Because you look at the HDR, then you look back at the SDR, and it's just like, no matter what you do or who you are, that SDR is going to look horrible in comparison to your HDR because of just the way our brains, you know, process stuff, right? So I actually got rid of the secondary monitor, the dual monitoring, and now what I tend to do is to take a break between, you know, do an HDR, and if I have to, you know, if it's the same day, I'll take a break for half an hour, not come back in the room, and just, you know, switch the monitor up to SDR and focus on that and work from there. And then as a final QC pass, I might bring, you know, dual monitoring back in just to double check myself. But most of the time I'm just doing a single monitoring just because the way at least my brain works.
Yeah, and I think the problem is that in the SDR, you are like trying to make that SDR HDR, but that's impossible. So what you are doing is that you are destroying the creative intent. It's like you are doing a new color. So, I mean, that's the risk. That's the risk. It's like you have to think like, okay, it's small. It's not going to look like that. So I'm also agree with Robbie. Just one monitor and just like, and at the final pass, we'll switch it.
Yeah, and like Diego just said, like it might be, you know, I think it's important for people to also understand, Jeff, that depending on the original HDR grade, there might not be a whole lot of work to do there anyway, right? Like, you know, I'm sure we'll talk about this at some point, but like, you know, if you have a 1,000-shot show, you know, 1,000-shot movie, it's not like you have to do a trim on every shot. And it's not like, you know, depending on how far you push the grade, you might not even have to do that many, you know? You know, Dolby has some suggestions about, you know, copying and pasting metadata and all that kind of stuff you can find in best practice documents. But it's important to, I think, for people to understand that that process can go actually pretty quick. And it's not nearly as a technical matching challenge as it's sometimes made out to be, because sometimes you just look at it and go, yeah, it looks great. Move on to the next shot.
Yeah, I think I agree because, you know, to your point, when you put the two side by side, it takes quite some time for you to get into that frame of mind where you understand how they coexist. You know, there are two different worlds, and, you know, trying to make them match can be a sort of a bad journey to take, because ultimately you'll have SDR that looks way too bright. and you spend that matching exercise for an hour, then you say, okay, let me just turn off the HDR and play back everything that I did, and you go, oh, that's a little too bright. I probably wouldn't have done that to my SDR if I was working just on the SDR by itself, right? So, and we have a lot of customers doing both, and that's one of the things I'd like to highlight is that over the last 5-7 years, Dolby Vision has become a worldwide. We have hundreds of, well, I would say about 1,000 users right now creating Dolby Vision on a day-to-day basis. And because of that, there's so much diversity in the way that happens. You have, like I said, here in LA, there's the whole high-end market, big budgets, two X300s at the same time. And then I have, in India and South America, I have people saying, yeah, we just sold our car and bought an X300 now. What do you want? Yeah. And it's like, what do I buy for my second monitor? And you go, well, it's up to you really, because ultimately it's up to you how you make that project work and how you sell it to your client, right? We used to hold the high ground in the early days. You had to have a Dolby Pulsar, which, give me a call and I'll explain what that was. And then you had to have one of those things to do Dolby Vision, and that's changed. Now we have about 6 or 7 different companies that make monitors. Companies like LG are coming up with these very impressive displays. Apple's doing amazing things with displays. So there's a wide range of displays that you can use. The trim, the 100-nit trim is almost mandatory for every delivery. I think everybody wants that. But the 600-nit trim depends on the studio. There are a few studios that request for it. Not all studios request for the 600. So if you have a 600-nit trim that is requested by your client, that sort of indicates you need 2 HDR monitors, right? That's, pops the budget of 50% of our target market. People say, oh, I can't afford 2 monitors. So the single monitor approach is becoming very popular, right? Quite a few people are doing that. I buy a good HDR monitor, I do my HDR. When it comes to the trim, like Robbie said, I take a break, go for lunch or something, come back, cleanse my visual palette, so to speak, and then switch to SDR and then just work on the SDR, right? And so yeah.
So let's talk about the aspiring colorist. What's the minimum that they need? I mean, we get into this. Well, like many of us look at a lot of forums, and there's always that person that goes, hey, can't I just use an iPad Pro? Can't I just do this? What would each of you feel like is hey, below this, I wouldn't compromise? And it starts probably with hardware monitoring, but I'll keep my mouth shut because you guys have opinions on this.
Jeff, I would say the first thing, though, that drives me crazy about some of those forums is that this kind of snobby attitude that, like, you can't gain experience unless you're doing it the official, like, not everybody can afford high-end HDR grading reference monitors. Not everybody needs them for their client base, right? As long as you go into this discussion with an open mind about potential technical limitations of different display technologies and stuff like that, my attitude is use whatever you can use to gain experience in this workflow and these methods, right? Like, I'm not the monitor police. It's not my, it's not our job to go and yell at you. They're like, oh, you're using an LG OLED. Well, like poo-poo that. I applaud anybody who is trying to get into it and have fun with it and experience that. With that said, of course, there are different, there's a reason a monitor costs $30,000. Like big post houses, if they didn't have to spend 30 grand on a monitor, they probably wouldn't spend 30 grand on a monitor, right? And a lot of them don't, to be honest with you.
No,
yeah. I think personally, I think the consumer range is so unbelievably better than it was just a couple of years ago. Like everybody talks about LG OLEDs, right? And LG OLED panels are used, of course, by Sony and Panasonic and others, just different software. That technology is amazing. You're getting, just under 1,000 nits for a lot of them. You're getting big displays. You're getting, even a lot of them can hold calibration LUTs now and all sorts of stuff, right? The only dig on that, and they're cheap, a grand, $1,500, $2,000, something like that. The only dig on those is just because of they use a white subpixel, the WRGB OLED. As you get brighter and brighter and brighter, from a technical term, we reduce color volume, right? So you kind of skew towards something being white. And I've actually had this experience before, just really pushing something, did a grade on an LG OLED, brought it to my reference monitor at the office, and I was like, oh yeah, those highlights are a little pink, right? And I didn't see that because of that color volume issue. But I mean, that's not a game stopper as far as I'm concerned. I think, again, just to say it, I think everybody who wants to try it should try it, and don't let the display necessarily be a limiting factor.
Yeah, and for example, I will say that try it and also start talking with the biggest studios and so on. So if you have something, okay, you can make the first thing, like the first part in your monitor, and then for the last shift, you go to that place and you make the last adjustments.
Yeah, we do that. We do that all the time. I have good friends that are like, hey, I'm not going to spend 30 grand on a monitor.
Yeah,
can I do this at home and then come over to your facility and do a final pass on it? And there's a lot of shows on Netflix and other places that do that very thing.
Yeah, I mean,
that's it.
And as Dolby, we stopped recommending monitors about 3-4 years ago. There used to be this Dolby list of monitors, and if you didn't have one of those, well, you couldn't do Dolby Vision. We stopped doing that because, like I said, it's a relationship between you and your client. If you can create pictures that your client is willing to pay for, I think you've done your work. That's what matters, right? The audience is never going to know. It's not like they said, was this graded on an X300? Or no, it's not like that. So I think it's very important for you to, like you guys mentioned, that it's important for everyone to try this, experience what it's all about. It opens up creativity in ways that you've never imagined. So that's very, very important. But then, like I always tell my students, and when I do a class, is confirm with the client beforehand. Don't let the client walk in and say, that's what you're grading on. Don't do that. I mean, make sure they know that this is what you're, do the necessary steps to convince them that you can make this work, right? If you have to, but it's not impossible. The options are way more today than it was 3 years ago, right? That's the way I'd put it.
That's the best thing, yeah.
Yeah, and I just think that there's this. I think it's a generally negative attitude by a lot of people. It's the internet, right? That happens. Negative attitudes happen on the internet, but you see this a lot by people kind of being the display police, and I just think it's unhealthy for our industry to kind of continue to grow in the HDR world if we're chastising people left and right for not the correct way, right?
That's why I asked this question, because I've heard the LG OLEDs. I've heard, grab what you have access to. Is there any other, aside from a display, we're definitely saying probably should have some calibration tools, or if you don't have any, you can go with what's out of the box?
I think there's 4 things, Jeff, that you want to look for, right? So number one is peak luminance of a display is often a misnomer. You look at a display and it says, oh, I do 2000 nits. But if you look at the fine print of that display, especially on the consumer end, sure, it does 2000 nits at a 2% area of the screen, right? As you get larger and larger, it's going to do less of that. So paying attention to that fun factor is good. You want to make sure that it actually follows some of these tone curves, whether that be PQ or HLG or whatever. Because if it's not doing that accurately, you're just kind of shooting in the dark, right? Unfortunately, a lot of them do that. I think 3, the other thing you want to look for is that it's going to, obviously, this is not a problem anymore, but it used to be, that it supports, the color gamuts that we're using, right? Whether that be P3D65 or Rec 2020 or any of those kind of things. And then the 4th thing is, I think you just have to be aware of some of the limitations of that display technology. I mean, the guys know, right? There's no such thing as a perfect display technology. Right now, if you want to go super, super bright, 4,000, 5,000 nits, well, you basically have to choose a full array local dimming display, like an LCD display, right? If you want something that's sort of set it and forget it, you might have to go OLED. Like there's no perfect display, and they all have, like, those full array looking dimming displays have issues with blooming potentially because they use different zones. OLEDs have problems with potentially with burn-in. There's these QD OLEDs that just came out now, like that has fringing. I mean, you have to just be aware. And I think one of the things I learned really early on, especially with the display I use, which is a FSI 310K, which is a 3000 nit mastering monitor. I equate it to driving between automatic and stick, right? I actually have to drive my monitor like I would drive a stick car. Like I'm not just steering, I'm driving it, right? Depending on what I'm doing, I'm turning on different backlight modes and different things to view the image in different ways. And that's an important thing to know what you're getting into.
And you guys say something important is that, I mean, as a colorist, it's like we have to learn new language. You just spoke about tone curves, new gamuts, so on. Then you talk about color management and so on. So I'm sure, Abby, it's like your training is also a color management training, right? Because it's like a whole new language that before we in some way knew it, but we didn't practice all the time. Right now in the configuration of the project, it's like we have to check if it's all right. Then when we are getting a monitor, we have to check all of the 4 things you said. And it's like, and also the main problem is when you talk about this to a client that doesn't want to know these things.
Exactly. It's way too complicated, right? They think, oh my God, what are you saying? One of the good things that has happened.
That's in line with what you said, though, Avi, is that like client expectations, right? Like if I'm at a huge grading company doing an A-list tentpole feature, that client's going to expect that I have all the gear, the reference gear, et cetera, to do that because they're paying hundreds of millions of dollars for a film, right? If I'm doing, a HDR YouTube video for a buddy of mine, like that's a totally different equation than that other scenario.
Agreed.
Sorry, just a quick thing is that one of the things I'm very happy about is that there's so much diversity in how Dolby Vision gets done today, right? And we deal with so many post houses all around the world. And, I walk into one and they say, oh, this is the way we do things. I use ACES, I use this monitor, I use that. I walk into the next place and they say, I hate ACES. I never touch the thing. And, that monitor, that's LCD. I would never use that. So it's so diverse. And that's what's great about it, right? It's that one way to do it all doesn't exist. You have to adapt. It's based on the type of content, the client that you're dealing with, the budgets that you're working with, and there are all these options. So you're not constrained to work in one way to do Dolby Vision anymore. It's all out there. You've got to put a little bit of thinking into it, but yeah.
I want to talk about some of those options in this way. Okay, we've got an HDR with whatever monitoring, and I'm pretty happy with it. How complex is the trim press procedure? Robbie, you mentioned a 1,000-shot piece. Is this a day? Is this a week? Let's talk a little bit about trim pass. How do you begin it? Obviously, you take a break. You come back for the trim pass. And then what sort of challenges?
Well, the first thing, just to separate this, the first step in that process is the analysis pass, right? Letting what we refer to as the internal CMU, the ICMU. Yes, there is still an eCMU. If anybody wants to buy one from me, let me know. I have it sitting in my machine room. But is that analysis pass? That's where the Dolby algorithm's doing its analysis on all the shot, and that's an important thing.
Magic.
Shot by shot, right? This is not a one, the whole movie at a time. It's shot by shot. Once that analysis is done, actually the first thing I do, Jeff, is I just watch the analysis down. Right? I'm not jumping in head first with making trims. I want to see what the algorithm did, because these things tend to kind of run in patterns, at least in my experience. It might be I look at a scene and go, oh, well, the analysis for that whole scene is a little dark or bright or whatever. And so I'm kind of making like a global adjustment to all the clips in that scene. And I want to be able to watch it first. But on average for something like a feature, yeah, it's probably about a day of work. Something shorter, half-hour show, you can do it in just, an hour or two. It's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that people should not feel compelled to trim every shot. Right. We see a lot of that. When I do a sort of a post-mortem on a trim, I look at it and I say, why did you trim the shot? And I said, no, well, I felt I had to do something. You don't. You know, I think the approach that you mentioned is perfect, which is see where you're off, right? The math, like I said, is, a lot of very intelligent people, far more intelligent than I am, put work into it to make this thing work. So see what they've done, see what the math is doing, and then see where it needs to be adjusted. Now, in a lot of cases, like I said, the more you stay within a certain range in terms of dynamic range and color, you may not need any adjustment. It's usually when you start pushing contrast to a little extreme, or color or things like that, where the system finds it difficult to create an equivalent in SDR. That's when it struggles, right? Let's say I pushed something to almost 100% P3 red, right? Remember Coke red? And then you brought it down to SDR. The mapping goes, I can't really find a red there. That doesn't exist. So I'm going to give you something very close to it, right? And then you say, I don't really like the hue there. I'd like to shift the hue. I'll give up my saturation just to get the right hue or something, right? And that's what the trims are supposed to do. Right? So you don't feel compelled to have to trim every shot, because that's not the philosophy behind what we were trying to do. Yeah, it's trying to give you the control to fine tune the mapping, right? It's not to make it, and that aiming for 100% perfection, don't go there, because like I said, it is SDR and HDR, two different worlds. Sometimes you cannot get that match, right? Or in a lot of cases, you cannot get that match, right? Because it's just not possible.
And Jeff, this is not, I want to be clear, this is my own opinion. This is not official Dolby speak, but I think it also, in my experience, the challenge has always been in this process is, what is that end SDR version going to look like, right? And the Dolby school of thought, which I think is accurate a lot of the time, is that you can actually get a better derived SDR version than you sometimes can get grading by hand, right? Then there's another school of thought that says, no. We're going to do the SDR version, right? And then we're going to sprinkle this HDR stuff on top, and we have this bespoke SDR version. Totally get that school of thought as well, right? And I think there's some merits to it. What I think is really important for people to understand is to have those conversations with clients about where the most eyeballs are going to be on something, right? If a client says to me, this is for SDR broadcasts and some film festivals, oh, and yeah, it would be kind of cool to have an HDR version, I might first focus on that SDR and do an SDR first into HDR version, right? But if somebody comes to me and is like, oh yeah, this is a new series for Netflix, like almost by mandate, I'm doing it the other way around, right? So I think it's really important to have these conversations with your clients. And that's also, Diego, who's done some awesome videos on this, by the way, you should check out his Netflix workflow videos.
They are awesome, Diego.
That is where I think personally good color management comes into play with this kind of stuff, because my work, I love ACES. I'm one of those guys who loves it, and the ability for me to like be in a project ACES and literally just change my ODT, go, oh, not SDR anymore, we're HDR, and make some trims. That's really powerful and gives my clients a lot of options for whatever we need to do.
So I want to unpack a couple of the questions we have here that we've been getting as we've been going. And the conversation has been so good and so focused. I haven't done my due diligence. I want to start with this one because it really kind of folds in with the SDR, HDR sort of questions. And it's, do you feel that there's right now an aesthetic of the trend of super dark grades? And an example the person used in chat here, this would be Lawman212. Dune, for example, I saw Dune in SDR and thought it was unintelligible, and I saw it again and it made more sense, but it was still very dark. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I'm sure everybody has their own aesthetic, right? But I want to point out, because I had this problem with that film, and I want to point out one thing that it possibly could be. Okay. And Abe knows more about this than I do, but one of the things that Dolby developed a few years ago and partnered with LG and others is this thing called Dolby IQ, right? And Dolby IQ is essentially technology that they let TV manufacturers implement however they want to implement it, right? But think about it as a light sensor in the TV, right? And I had this experience with Dune because I was watching it one Saturday afternoon with my kids, started at like 3 o'clock. There's a lot of ambient light in the room, right? And I paused it because kids were running around, dinner, etc. Came back to the film, right? It's still paused, and started watching it after the sun had gone down again. And I was like, I can't see anything, or after which way it was, right? But because the IQ on my television had taken a reading when the film first started, it was using that for the rest of the time. And it took me a second. I was like, what? There's no way the colorist created it like this, right? So I went back out to the menu, restarted the film, total different experience, right? Because of the way my particular TV and IQ was doing that analysis. I'm not saying that's the solve for everything, but I found that so illuminating. I was just like,
that's nice. That's a great tip. I didn't know about it, and I had this experience. And I was like, what is happening to my eye? What I'm doing?
But I guess it also said something about the TVs that don't have this technology, that don't have the Dolby pieces. You're kind of in a little bit of a Wild West game in that regards and watching, unless you watch always in a dark room.
Yeah. So, to that point, when you create SDR today, I mean, you created 100 nits or 120 nits or whatever. Remember that the average TV out there today is going to stretch that, right? There's no 100 nit SDR TV. You buy a TV today, it's going to stretch it to 200 or 300 or whatever. Now, what we've seen is that if you've graded HDR content at 100 or 200 nits, that 100, 200 nits in Dolby Vision will be 100, 200 nits when it plays back. Now, when you graded it in a very dark room, and on your $35,000 OLED monitor, so everything looks perfect and beautiful and all that. But when that plays back at home, you sometimes may see that my SDR tends to look brighter than my HDR. And that's the reason we brought IQ into the picture, because we found that ambient light sensing is so critical, because a lot of people, do leave their windows open when they're watching it. And if you don't have IQ, the TV looks too dark and you think, why is that? Why is that? And then later in the evening, when lights go down, you play the same movie again, you'll think, oh, that looks much better. Because, well, that's how it was meant to be seen. It was how it was graded. But yeah, I mean, and there's another thing, right? A lot of cinematographers that I've worked with, when it comes to HDR, rather than going brighter, they like the blacks. They tend to want to push things into the dark because they're like, oh, look at all that detail in the shadows. Look at all that. Look at all that. And there's a little trap that you fall into, right? You may see a lot of dark detail on an OLED like an X300, but remember, no TV can reproduce that. Right, and that can be a big problem also, right? So the colorist or the client, whatever, may push things into the darks, which you cannot see on an average TV. So there is this, mix of things, and that's one of the reasons we brought IQ in, to try and control that, right? But
Nice.
You're right.
Yeah.
There is that.
Jeff, I think it's just that how audio mixers for the longest time, especially in music audio making, they would, I'm dating myself here, but they'd make a CD or a tape, right, and take it out to the car and listen to it there and see how that translates. I do think that's an important, I mean, by definition, that's what Dolby Vision's doing, but I think it's also kind of important to test those scenarios as well. A couple of years ago, I was out at Dolby in Sunnyvale with my friend Shane Ruggieri, who's a colorist at Dolby and does a lot of R&D stuff. And walk into his room and he has like 15 monitors going on in the room, right? And I'm like, Shane, what is going on here? And again, it's to give him sort of that institutional knowledge of how things are going to translate onto different display technologies and different viewing conditions. And that's just like a mixer does. A mixer goes, well, yeah, we can take the bass all the way up here, but on a car speaker, it's going to sound terrible, right? And I think that's kind of, part of the, the learning process here too.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I get to this, because I think that's, while it's very specialized, it's such a great question. There doesn't seem to be a lot of accessible direction around Dolby Vision or really HDR animation workflows. And Richard Cross says, should I convince my client to give me a reference timeline, the linear footage from the compositor, so I can convert them to to ACES to make the HDR grade a tad easier? Is there any specific feelings here about animation workflows?
Yeah, I mean, I can start off, but Robbie, I think, it's important to give a real world perspective. But what we are seeing, one is if it's legacy animations, I mean, things that have been around for years and you're sort of remastering into HDR. Is that, go ahead. Jeff.
This person is a brand new show. It's a prospective item. So it's going to be coming out of animation software, probably linearized.
One of the big challenges we see in animation is that you have 50 animators or 100 animators working. None of them have an HDR monitor.
Yeah.
So which means everyone's working on an SDR display. Now, they have an intent. They know what HDR could potentially look like, and they probably are working on scopes or something to try and make it look like that. But the first time that anyone looks at it in PQ is when the colorist puts it up on the color corrector. So what we usually see is that because you have not or visualized it in HDR, when you grade it, you're sort of limited to how much you can really open things up. And, did you render it in 8-bit or 10-bit? Is it sRGB, which is most likely? So when you bring it into P3 or Rec 2020 and you're on a 1000-nit OLED monitor and you're in PQ, the colorist is then at that point where you're deciding, where do you want me to place this, right? Because if I went to town with it, it might look completely different from the way you intended it. So I think from that perspective, it's always good to get a reference. Having a reference there keeps you, honest and in control. And then you can decide how much of HDR you want to put into it, right? Because it is a problem, right? Till monitors become widely available. And this is the case with visual effects, the same thing, right? Because most visual effects artists are working on an SDR monitor. They may have lookup tables that mimic what HDR can look like and all that, but nothing like the real thing, so. Yeah.
I agree. That's 100% spot on. I think the HDR part of that problem is actually a very small part of it. It's largely color management pipelines that get in the way of this kind of working well. And depending on the visual effects artist or the animator, OpenICO, there's color management pipelines. ACES is a great one, obviously ACES CG and all that kind of stuff. But like I've had the problem, it's not just the color management pipeline, but like you get, somebody who's not familiar with like layered EXR files or doesn't know how to give you mattes, right? And so you're looking at this thing that could be totally colorful and awesome, but it's just flat, right? And you're having to do all this weird windowing to get it. It's a very complex world. And I agree, like workflow design and testing in that kind of pipeline literally could save you, tens of thousands of dollars to get it right.
Yeah, Robbie, you and I have had that conversation before where we go, no matter what, don't believe us, test your workflow. If you test, and from soup to nuts, beginning to end, otherwise, when something goes wrong, it's just a nightmare.
Well, it's also a horrible feeling to be in the room with clients and going, I have no idea why this looks like this, right? Like you want to have some control over it.
Yes, that's nice.
Absolutely. We're getting towards the top of the hour. I'm going to ask you for a moment about some last thoughts here, of anything that you want to make sure you feel that's important to talk about, as well as where people can find you. I, of course, am going to mention again that Color Space Cadets is part of iColorist, and it's something we do to extend out to the community. We've got the Colorist Mixer coming up in April. In May, we have ColorFest. ColorFest, 6 instructors, 15 plus topics across all sorts of time zones across the month of May, with individual session pricing as well as a price for everything. Diego, I'm going to start with you, buddy. Aside from where we can find you, do you have big thoughts about things about HDR that you feel that are really important that might have gotten missed here?
So actually, one of the things that I see in talking with different colorists and so on is that they are letting, some facilities are letting the assistant colorist to make the trim pass. Many. So when they say that to me, I'm like, hey, the trim pass, actually the SDR version is going to be the one that more people are going to look. So probably just 90% of the people are going to look at your work. So what I will say as a colorist is, if that's the case and that the company is saying to you the assistant colorist is going to do the trim pass, as a colorist I will say no, do the trim pass, because it's your work, it's the one that is going to view more people. But every time I see more that more assistant colorists are doing trim pass, probably because of money or probably because the colorists have to do another thing. But I mean, it's like you are letting your color to some other person that probably you will not like, or maybe you will like. So it's a risk.
Robbie, anything you think that's important that we might miss, or might have missed, might not have gotten the attention that's really important?
Yeah, it's really hard in an hour-long conversation to cover this in a completist kind of way. But I would say, there's got to be some research and just self-discovery in this, right? I think one of the most intimidating parts about the HDR landscape is that everything is an acronym, right? And everything is NITS that, PQ this, HLG that. Like it's really hard to get those things. But I think that one of the things that people can help themselves with and to have better, more intelligent conversations is to really get some of these foundational things down, right? And understand what all these acronyms mean. What does tone mapping really mean? What is color volume, all that kind of stuff, because then you can start having conversations rather than just yelling at each other about my monitor does this, your monitor does that, right? I think the other thing is that, this is not just limited to HDR, but like in the past 10 years as a colorist, I've moved from really kind of being a colorist, a craft colorist, into having to have engineering and color science background that we didn't used to have. And that's partly because, there's not huge, great facilities all over anymore. It's kind of consolidated, more people are working on their own. But it's also just the stuff has gotten more mathy. I don't know if that word, that's a real word. But I think one of the biggest benefits people can learn in this workflow is color management pipelines and mastering that, whether it's ACES, RCM, baseline, whatever. And really understanding how those pipelines can work, because I gotta tell you, and Diego and guys, you've probably seen this, 99% of the problems in an HDR pipeline have nothing to do with the creative. Like zero, like to do with the creative. Like the colorists, the clients, they all know what they want to get there, they can see it, the guy, the guy or girl can push the buttons the right way. It's, oh yeah, totally right, we totally forgot that we were supposed to be in P3D65, but we were actually had the monitor set up to Rec 2020 and there was a mismatch, and like all of that kind of stuff really is huge. I mean, and Avi knows this, he probably answers more support questions a day about people having their color management settings one thing, their monitor set up another thing. And so I do think that it's really kind of getting mastery over those parts of this equation that will save you so much time and angst and really get you to the fun stuff. And I think that's the last thing I'd say is that is what HDR grading has done to me. I got to this point a few years ago that I just felt like I walked into the suite every day and it was lift, gain, okay, saturation, right? And it just felt so monotonous to me. And then what HDR grading has done to me, it's like it's really reinvigorated my creative energy for doing this stuff, right? Like, and that is something, that's why I want people to, like, no matter whether you're doing it the right way or the wrong way or the middle way or whatever, is to experience that thrill of going, I mean, literally jaw-dropping sometimes to go, holy cow, right? Like that is just unbelievable. And once you get that, you'll be hooked.
Would you say, Robbie, it added some vibrancy to your job?
I see what you did there.
Yeah, so sorry. I couldn't look. That's the peril of being a dad. Jokes happen, whether or not I want them to. Abby, you've heard from us, but you're there. What big pieces do we need to add? We've added in the chat. We're going to add to the YouTube page to make sure everybody's aware of the training resources that Dolby provides. Anything big that we've missed that you feel would be a mistake for us to leave without knowing?
Yeah, I think there are Robbie's point, it's really difficult to cover everything in an hour. But I think, but one of the things we've been doing over the last couple of years is that every time I get a question more than 3 times, we put it into our knowledge base. Okay, so we have something called the Dolby Professional Support page. If we can put a link up to that, that'll be great. So the thing is, yeah, like I said, I get questions all around the clock every day, people saying, I don't know, this is not working, that's not doing what I expected. And when that happens, we try to put an article in there, right? Saying from a Dolby Vision perspective, this is what you need to do. But then these are related pieces of knowledge that you need to have. Things like ACES, things like color management, things like, what is PQ? What's the difference between P3 and Rec 2020? All these different delivery specs that you have for different studios. So there are so many aspects to it that are important, but we're here to try and make that easy. Right? We want you as colorists to focus on the creative. We want you guys to make, guys and girls, to make better looking pictures. That's the goal, right? HDR is nothing if the pictures don't look better, right? And that's what Dolby is here for. We want to make sure that your creativity gets from your color suite to the consumer. That's what Dolby Vision is all about, right? So, and we are trying to make Dolby Vision easier and easier and easier so that all you focus on is making those better looking pictures, right? And that's very, very important.
Yeah. So I'm just going to do a quick little summary. Feel free if you want to add something else in. The whole Dolby HDR actual object is a finishing space more than it is working. What it does magically is, and I'm going to say magically or mathemagically, Robbie, is it does a great job of creating an SDR piece of metadata for that deliverable.
I would just correct you by saying downstream, because it could be other HDR versions as well.
You're right, my friend. There's a tendency when you first get playing into this pond of turning everything to 12 and overdoing it. And there's this real big feeling that we would like you to have the right equipment, but even with the wrong equipment, it's more important to play in the pool than it is to play that snobbish, oh, you've got to have this monitor or not.
And understand those limitations. And just one more thing about that, the language thing. I've watched more movies and shows of the past couple of years because I'm trying to devour other people's work, right? And try to figure out what's working, what's not working, what I like. And I think that's an important part of this. If you're going to get better at HDR workflows and HDR grading, like really consuming as much of it as you possibly can is a big deal.
Continuing forward, you tend to overcrank at the beginning of the grade just to see stuff, but you're pulling down the average picture level, the APL, to something that's a little bit, not necessarily at 100 nits, but closer to SDR levels of like 2 to 3 to 400, depending, of course, on the content. Let's see what else I have here as notes. One of the beautiful things about working top down with Dolby of HDR to SDR is the SDR pass is very, very fast. A 1,000-shot film might be able to be done in a day, but it's where is the bulk of this going to be watched? If it's going to be watched in SDR, maybe it makes sense to do an SDR pass before that HDR pass. Of course, you're doing this with clients in the room and keeping their expectations in line with the way that you're working. I just want to see anything else. There's, of course, this mistake we made at the beginning of HDR about grading into a dark room, and Dolby IQ really helps that. It's a light sensor in the television, and it's what maybe has caused a little bit of this trend. And Robbie's, technique of maybe stopping the film, going back out to the main menu and coming back in to really seeing it can make a difference.
That was a weird one.
And then I'm just trying to see if there's anything else here. Dolby's got great training resources that Diego's helped create, that Robbie's been involved with. They've got a professional support page. I don't know if we've managed to get it into the chat, but we have managed to get it into the chat already. I want to, before we find out where we can locate you outside of Color Space Cadets, I'm going to mention that Color Space Cadets is a monthly item that happens towards Thursday of the month. Of course, today is a Monday. You know, we happen to have great people, and it's more important for it to be about the great people than it is to be about that Thursday necessarily. We have loads of videos and training resources on iColorist, as well as actual hands-on instructor-led classes from Colorist to help you take your work, take your skill set further. With that being said, Mr. Carmen, where can we find you?
Yeah, you can always, if you have some questions or want me to clarify something we talked about, you can always email me, robbie@dccolor.com. 2 C's in that, DC as in like Washington, DC, and color. Also, for 10 years plus, I was a partner over at mixinglink.com, which is an amazing resource for all color stuff. Check that out. That's very cool. Of course, the ICA as well. Yeah, that's pretty much me.
Diego.
I mean, I love LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn. I think it's the best way to communicate between professionals, if you want to know a person, definitely write him by LinkedIn. So, I mean, my last name is not so common, so definitely you will find me there.
Abby, what about you? Where can we find you?
Again, LinkedIn, I think, is great. I have a Dolby email ID if you're interested. It's aby.mathew. So it's a Matthew with a single T. Yeah,
it's right over your right shoulder. Thank God.
There you go.
It's right over your right shoulder.
I saw that.
Yeah, everyone does it with the double T's, but yeah, it's a single T. Again, ab.matthew@dolby.com. You can get in touch with me if you have questions or anything you want to ask about Dolby Vision. Yeah, I'm here.
And you should not ask me about Dolby Vision, because I'm going to end up recommending you talk to my 3 friends here over myself for it, other than the gross 10,000 foot level stuff. My name's Jeff Greenberg. You can find me on LinkedIn at Jeff Greenberg. You can find me at Film Geek and many other places. I'm going to mention again the Colorist Mixer on the 30th of April, sort of a near NAB virtual item. We, at the bottom of 2020, we did a 24-hour mixer, Abby, where we, for an entire day in every time zone, went through. This one will be a lot shorter. I think it's only 4 or so hours, might be a little longer. We've got Color Fest coming up all the month of May. Classes for as cheap as $99 US, a little bit more for the entire package. Thank you for joining us with Color Space Cadets. Hope to see you next month. Feel free to reach out in any of these venues. And big hands to my friends for coming up and giving us such great knowledge. Thanks again, everybody. And thanks, Ms. Shaw, for being in the background and making sure we stay on time and in place.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.